Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I invite you to join me on a special journey where the past comes alive with fates, tragedies, and extraordinary moments forever engraved in history. And now, let us begin the story. As the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union dragged on, Hitler and his high command found themselves staring at an uncomfortable truth. Their victories were impressive on paper, but they were falling short of the war's most critical objective. Operation Barbarossa had been conceived not only as a lightning strike to seize Soviet territory, but as a campaign to supply the Third Reich with the lifeblood of modern warfare, oil. Germany was running out of fuel, and without fuel tanks became bunkers, planes became statues, and the Blitzkrieg itself, the very doctrine of fast mechanized war, would collapse. Even with Romania, their junior partner, pouring over 100,000 tons of oil into Germany's collective reservoir each month, it was not enough. The Wehrmacht burned through their supplies faster than they could be replaced. Every division that rolled forward into the vast Russian steppe was like a man running deeper into the desert with an ever-shrinking canteen. And so Hitler's gaze shifted southward to the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus, a prize that glittered in his mind like salvation. The plan was given a name, Fall Blau, or Case Blue. In the summer of 1942, the Nazis would concentrate their efforts on southern Soviet territory with the goal of seizing the Caucasian oil wells. It was a gamble, but one Hitler believed he had no choice but to make. Oil meant survival. Oil meant victory. Without it, Germany would wither. But Hitler, restless and intoxicated by both ambition and paranoia, could not resist meddling with the plan. At first, Stalingrad had not figured prominently in Case Blue. It was merely a city on the Volga, important as a transport hub, yes, with factories and steelworks, but hardly the kind of target that determined the fate of nations. Yet for Hitler, the city's name alone carried a kind of poisonous allure. It bore the name of his great ideological rival, Joseph Stalin. To capture Stalingrad would not only cut Soviet supply arteries, but humiliate his enemy. The struggle for oil now fused with a struggle of egos, of symbols. It is easy to underestimate the weight of such decisions in hindsight, but Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad transformed the campaign. What began as a calculated strike for resources mutated into something more dangerous, a war of prestige. German generals trained to think in terms of strategy and logistics groaned at the change, but Hitler's word was law, and law was final. Thus, the summer of 1942 carried with it a foreboding momentum. The Wehrmacht, still lethal but stretched thin, prepared to advance once more. Millions of men would be driven forward by one man's hunger for oil and one man's vanity. For the Germans, Stalingrad was supposed to be a stepping stone to the Caucasus. For the Soviets, it would become the line in the sand. Neither side knew it yet, but the course of the war, the fate of Europe itself, was about to hinge on the banks of the Volga. On the morning of June 28, 1942, the earth shook with the roar of engines as the German offensive Case Blue burst into motion. Waves of panzers, half-tracks, and infantry columns poured across the steppe, raising dust clouds so vast that villages miles away reported skies turned brown. For many Soviet defenders, the second year of war felt hauntingly like the first. Once again, the Nazi war machine lunged eastward with terrifying speed. Once again, the Red Army was caught off balance. To the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the advance seemed at first like vindication. They cut through Soviet lines with the same terrifying efficiency that had carried them to the gates of Moscow the previous year. By mid-July, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, stood within striking distance of Stalingrad. Maps in Hitler's headquarters showed great black arrows stabbing deep into the Soviet Union, splitting apart like the claws of a beast. Group A pushed toward the Caucasus to claim its oil. Group B veered toward the Volga and Stalingrad, tasked with securing the flank and severing Soviet transport. Yet, beneath the outward momentum cracks were already forming. The Wehrmacht of 1942 was not the same force that had surged across Europe in 1939 and 1940. The long slog of Barbarossa had drained its lifeblood. Supply lines now stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile scorched earth. Each kilometer forward meant another kilometer of rail track to repair another convoy of horses and wagons dragged across muddy roads. Another delay as fuel crawled up from Romania or Germany. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horses, often forgotten in the myth of mechanized blitzkrieg, became painfully clear. Two-thirds of their transport animals trudged behind the tanks hauling guns and food. When rations failed to reach the front, starving soldiers slaughtered their own animals for meat. The clatter of hooves that once signaled mobility turned into the hollow crunch of bones beneath soldiers' knives. It was a grim omen, a reminder that even the most modern army in the world could starve like an ancient host on a forgotten steppe. Disease stalked the German columns as relentlessly as the Soviets. Typhus and dysentery spread through contaminated water, and lice tore into the ranks. In some units, a quarter of all casualties were not from bullets or shells, but from fevers that left men delirious on the roadside. Medical supplies ran thin. Field hospitals overflowed with gaunt soldiers whose bodies bore no wounds, only the invisible scars of hunger and infection. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler's orders became more erratic. He had originally intended the offensive to concentrate on the Caucasus, but his obsession with Stalingrad kept growing. Against the advice of his generals, he split Army Group South into two Group A, to march south into the mountains, and Group B to push toward the Volga. To divide strength in the face of such vast distances was a recipe for disaster. Yet Hitler believed simultaneous victories would cement his place as history's master strategist. The Soviets, reeling but not broken, scrambled to respond. Stalin and his generals had learned from the disasters of 1941. No longer would entire armies be allowed to disintegrate in panicked retreats. Moscow understood the stakes. The Volga was a lifeline. Allied supplies flowing through Persia and up the river fueled the Soviet war efforts. If the Germans reached the Volga at Stalingrad, they could sever this artery and tighten the noose around the Soviet heartland. As Paulus's 6th Army crept closer, Stalin's voice echoed across the Soviet Union. His speeches thundered with both rage and desperation, demanding total resistance. Men, women, and even children were mobilized not only into the Red Army, but into factories, trenches, and makeshift barricades. Moscow's propaganda painted the struggle not as a fight for land, but for survival itself. The Volga is life won, Pravda headline declared, and Stalingrad is the gate to life. The mood among ordinary soldiers reflected the growing tension. German diaries later captured reveal men both exhilarated and uneasy. They wrote of boundless plains without end and of villages burned to ash before we arrive. Some still believed the war would soon be over. Others whispered uneasily about the endlessness of Russia, its land, its people, its capacity to absorb pain. For the Soviets, the memory of the previous year's retreat was fresh. Entire cities had been abandoned, populations, uprooted factories, dismantled, and carried east beyond the Urals. Now, as summer baked the Volga steppe, there was a new determination. Civilians were ordered to dig anti-tank ditches by hand, armed only with shovels and picks. School teachers led their students to construction sites. Women who had never held a weapon before drilled with rifles in the streets. Every brick must be a barricade. Every street a fortress, declared one Soviet leaflet. By July 23rd, Hitler issued his command. Stalingrad was to be taken. What had been a calculated step in case blue now hardened into an obsession. The oil of the Caucasus was still the official prize, but the city named after Stalin had become something greater. To Hitler, it was a duel between himself and his rival. To Stalin, it became the test of the Red Army's will to fight. On the horizon, dust storms from advancing columns mixed with smoke from burning villages. The Volga glittered faintly in the distance, its waters carrying barges of supplies, even as German planes prowled above. The soldiers marching toward Stalingrad could not yet know it, but they were walking into a furnace from which few would return. The fate of the campaign and perhaps the entire war would hinge on a city that had once been little more than an afterthought. The summer heat pressed down like an iron weight. German supply lines grew thinner with every step. Horses collapsed on the roadside, soldiers grew leaner, weaker, and yet the black arrows on Hitler's maps kept moving east, relentless, unbending. The Wehrmacht was on the march, and Stalingrad was waiting. While Hitler's armies pressed eastward, Joseph Stalin was not blind to the threat. Reports from Soviet intelligence and the rhythm of German troop movements convinced him that the focus of the enemy had shifted south. The oil of the Caucasus was indeed the ultimate target, but the Volga and Stalingrad were now clearly in Hitler's sights. And so, even before Paulus's columns reached the outskirts of the city, Stalin had already begun to prepare his counter-narrative, one that would bind soldiers and civilians alike to the defense of the Soviet Union. Factories across the Soviet heartland, many of them dismantled and relocated beyond the Urals after the disasters of 1941, now thundered day and night. Tanks rolled off assembly lines in numbers that shocked even German planners. Women who had once been school teachers, nurses, or shopkeepers now stood at lathes and forges, hammering steel plates and welding turrets. Every hour mattered. The tanks we make today read one poster pinned to the wall of a factory in the Urals, "Fight tomorrow at Stalingrad." Stalin also understood the psychological front. He knew that morale within the Red Army was fragile after a year of defeats and retreats. Whispers circulated among the rank and file. Perhaps the best course of action was to continue falling back, drawing the Germans deeper into Russia's vastness until the time was right to strike. After all, the endless steppe was their ally, winter their secret weapon. Why throw away lives in hopeless stands? To Stalin, this thinking was poison. If soldiers kept retreating, entire cities would fall without a fight, and the civilian population would lose all faith in their defenders. And so, on July 27, 1942, Stalin issued the infamous Order Number 227. Its language was blunt, uncompromising, and merciless. Not a step back. The order declared that every retreat without direct orders from higher command would be punished severely. Officers who abandoned positions would face tribunals. Soldiers who fled could expect to be executed by blocking detachments stationed behind them. Deserters would no longer disappear quietly into the chaos of war, they would be hunted and shot. Stalin's decree transformed hesitation into treason. Yet behind the terror lay a careful political message. Stalin's propaganda machine framed the order not merely as a command from above, but as a response to the pleas of ordinary people. The Russian workers, it declared, curse the Red Army when it abandons them. Mothers weep as their sons are left to the mercy of the Germans. Every step back is betrayal. Stalin thus turned fear into duty. Defending the soil became synonymous with defending one's family. This narrative was reinforced on the home front. Civilians were mobilized on an unprecedented scale. In Stalingrad, women and children dug trenches on the city's outskirts with shovels, picks, and bare hands. Teenagers were drafted into emergency brigades that worked 12-hour shifts in arms factories, then marched straight to defensive works. Elderly men too old for the front carried bricks and sandbags, fortifying buildings that would soon become strong points. The war was no longer confined to the battlefield. It had invaded every kitchen, every school, every street. Accounts from survivors tell us that the mood in Stalingrad was one of grim acceptance. People knew what was coming. The Germans were advancing their reputation as an unstoppable juggernaut still intact, despite the failure before Moscow. But there was no thought of evacuation on a mass scale. The city's workers were told bluntly they would stay, they would fight, or they would die. In this sense, Stalingrad was not only defended by soldiers, it was defended by the willpower of an entire society forced into the crucible of war. Order number 227 cut deep into the psyche of the Red Army. Soldiers cursed it privately, knowing that retreat was no longer an option, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet it also hardened them. To stand and fight was now the only path left. Commanders issued pistols to political commissars, whose task was not just to inspire, but to enforce. Behind the lines, NKVD troops formed barriers rifles ready to shoot their own comrades if they attempted to run. Western observers later condemned the order as barbaric, but its effect was undeniable. The Red Army that faced the Germans at Stalingrad was no longer the army that had collapsed in the summer of 1941. Discipline, however, cruelly maintained held, and with with discipline came resilience. By August, Stalin's preparations were nearly complete. The factories had delivered waves of new tanks and artillery. Reserves drawn from across the Soviet Union streamed toward Stalingrad. Whole divisions that had been shattered months earlier were reconstituted and thrown into the defense. In Moscow, Stalin told his generals that this was no longer about territory, it was about honor, about survival. If we give up Stalingrad, he warned, we will have to give up the Caucasus. If we give up the Caucasus, we lose the war. To the Germans, these developments were invisible. From their vantage point, the Red Army still appeared to be retreating. Paulus's divisions pressed forward, unaware that they were marching into a trap laid not only by Soviet steel, but by Soviet will. Stalingrad itself became a paradoxical city in the weeks before the battle began in earnest. Life went on in strange rhythms, factories belching smoke as children carried water to firewatch stations, classrooms where teachers lectured until the air raid sirens wailed, wedding ceremonies interrupted by the thunder of distant artillery. People clung to routines not because they believed the city would be spared, but because routines were the only way to remain human in the shadow of catastrophe. The stage was thus set for one of the greatest clashes in history. On the banks of the Volga, 500,000 civilians braced themselves. On the steppe, more than 1 million Axis soldiers advanced their boots, grinding the dust of Russia beneath them. Above, the Luftwaffe scouted the skies, preparing to unleash devastation. And between them all, Stalin's words echoed like iron. Not one step back. What neither Hitler nor Stalin could fully know was how absolute those words would become. The battle about to unfold would devour divisions whole, reduce a great city to rubble, and scar the memory of an entire generation. In the war for oil, for prestige, and for survival, Stalingrad was about to become not just a battlefield, but a legend. On August 21, 1942, German divisions reached the Don River. The wide expanse of water marked the threshold of Stalingrad's defense, and as the Wehrmacht prepared to cross, the battle for the city's soul began. For days, the Soviet defenders watched with grim anticipation, knowing that once the Germans reached the Volga, the city itself would be the front line. 2 days later, on August 23rd, the war arrived with fire from the sky. The Luftwaffe, Germany's once dominant air arm, unleashed one of the most devastating bombardments of the Second World War. More than 1,000 tons of bombs fell on Stalingrad in a matter of hours, transforming the 500,000-strong city into a furnace. Eyewitnesses described the sound as a rolling thunder that never ended. Apartment blocks crumbled like sandcastles under the weight of explosives. Wooden houses erupted into flame in seconds. Oil tanks and fuel depots exploded, sending black columns of smoke curling high above the Volga, blotting out the sun. The river itself seemed to burn as debris and fuel spread across its surface, igniting in patches of fire that drifted with the current. Between 40,000 and 75,000 civilians were killed in a single night. Families suffocated in basements as buildings collapsed above them. Streets became mazes of rubble, with survivors stumbling blindly through smoke. Those who reached the riverbanks hurled themselves into the water only to drown in the chaos or be cut down by machine gun fire from circling aircraft. One survivor later recalled, "We no longer saw the sky. It was as if the whole world was burning." The German advance followed swiftly behind the bombardment. Spearheads pressed toward the city, encountering resistance fiercer than they had anticipated. Soviet soldiers, many of them hastily armed workers and students, fought desperately on the approaches. At times, whole battalions were wiped out in an afternoon, but each hour bought was another moment for reinforcements to dig in deeper inside the city. Still, the Wehrmacht pressed forward. To the north, German units drove through shattered suburbs and reached the Volga, only to find themselves cut off by Soviet counterattacks. Encircled, they fought desperately, clinging to survival until relief arrived. For the Germans, it was an unsettling glimpse of what was to come. Encirclement isolation, fighting for every drop of water and scrap of food. Meanwhile, the 4th Panzer Army, under General Hermann Hoth, swung from the south, aiming to close the jaws around Stalingrad. At first, Soviet defenses faltered. Civilians panicked, flooding the streets as rumors spread of a breakthrough. Yet, once again, the Red Army countered. Soldiers withdrew to stronger positions within the city's outskirts, abandoning ground in exchange for defensive depth. For every block lost, a trench or barricade awaited the invaders. The NKVD Stalin's secret police played a crucial role in this phase. Entire divisions of NKVD riflemen had been stationed in Stalingrad to maintain order and enforce Stalin's decrees. When the Germans closed in, these men were thrown directly into combat. They fought with ferocity, born not only of discipline but of desperation. For many, retreat was unthinkable. Behind them stood political officers ready to execute deserters. Ahead of them stood the Wehrmacht. Between those two choices, there was only one path forward. By the end of August, the northern and southern thrusts of the German advance began to converge. Paulus's 6th Army linked up with Hoth's panzers after days of savage fighting, stabilizing the line but leaving both forces battered. The city now lay within reach. The bombing campaign that had begun on August 23rd continued into September, grinding Stalingrad into dust. Yet paradoxically, this destruction favored the defenders. What had once been broad boulevards turned into heaps of broken stone and steel. Collapsed factories became fortresses, their jagged ruins forming natural strongpoints. The Luftwaffe had promised Hitler that the city could be crushed into submission. Instead, the rubble created a labyrinth where Soviet troops could ambush tanks, hide artillery, and wage a new kind of war, a battle fought room by room, wall by wall. For the civilians still alive inside Stalingrad, the city had become hell. They dug shelters beneath ruins, carried buckets of water from the Volga under constant fire, and scavenged for food among corpses and wreckage. Children hauled ammunition to the front lines while mothers sewed sandbags until their fingers bled. Many believed they would not survive, but survival was no longer the measure. To live one more day to resist one more attack was itself a form of victory. The Germans, for their part, believed they were closing in on triumph. By late August, Hitler proclaimed that Stalingrad would fall within weeks. His generals, however, knew better. The supply lines were stretched to breaking. The men were already exhausted, and the Soviets showed no signs of collapse. Still, Hitler pressed them on. For him, Stalingrad was no longer just a strategic objective, it was a symbol. And so, as August bled into September, the stage was set for a new kind of battle. The Luftwaffe's firestorm had not broken the city. It had merely lit the furnace in which both armies would be consumed. The front lines were no longer lines at all, but shattered neighborhoods, bridges of rubble, and half-destroyed factories where death lurked behind every wall. The German 6th Army prepared to enter Stalingrad itself. What awaited them inside was unlike anything they or the world had ever seen. The first week after the August firestorm saw the Wehrmacht tighten its grip. German spearheads thrust into the suburbs of Stalingrad, confident that their momentum would sweep the Soviets aside. Paulus's 6th Army pressed from the west, while Hoth's 4th Panzer Army lunged from the south, hoping to link their advances and crush the defenders between them. For the Germans, this was supposed to be the decisive stroke: surround, isolate, and then dismantle the city's defenses block by block. Yet the city and its defenders refused to cooperate with Hitler's timetable. Soviet units, bloodied but unbroken, clung to positions with fanatical determination. In the north, a German spearhead reached the Volga, only to find themselves cut off by Soviet counterattacks. Encircled, General Gustav Anton von Wiedersheim's troops endured days of isolation before relief columns arrived. They held out long enough to be rescued, but the cost was staggering. The episode rattled German officers. They had grown accustomed to Soviet armies disintegrating under pressure, retreating deeper into the endless steppe. Now, instead of collapse, they faced counterpunches. The Red Army had learned its lessons. Even when outflanked Soviet units dug in, fought from ruins, and counterattacked at night. For the first time since the campaign began, German commanders muttered uneasily about the possibility of being encircled themselves. Hoth's thrust from the south fared little better. His armored spearheads initially surged forward, but their success was fleeting. Soviet commanders, recognizing the peril, withdrew to more defensible lines inside the city. NKVD divisions, once assigned to police duties, now stood shoulder to shoulder with regular soldiers on the front lines. These men fought with a grim intensity that shocked even hardened German veterans. They were political soldiers indoctrinated to see retreat as treason, and they fought accordingly. In one southern district, NKVD troops held out for days against tanks and artillery, their rifles barely sufficient against German armor. When their ammunition ran low, they ambushed tanks with grenades and Molotov cocktails swarming vehicles from alleys and sewers. German tankers wrote in their diaries of the unnerving sensation of driving into a seemingly empty street, only to be engulfed in fire and explosions within seconds. Civilians, too, were drawn deeper into the struggle. In neighborhoods not yet consumed by the front residents dug trenches and fortified basements. Women boiled water for field kitchens while children carried cartridges to machine gun nests. One German officer remarked bitterly that every civilian in Stalingrad is a soldier, and every house is a fortress. As September loomed, both sides had been ground down by nearly continuous fighting. Paulus's 6th Army, despite its initial momentum, was showing signs of exhaustion. Supply lines stretched over hundreds of kilometers left his divisions perpetually short of fuel, ammunition, and rations. German soldiers gnawed on horse meat, their belts tightened against hunger. Disease, typhus, and dysentery especially spread unchecked in the dust and heat. By late August, a quarter of Paulus's casualties were not battle wounds, but sickness. The Red Army, meanwhile, paid a staggering price for its defiance. Entire divisions had been reduced to a fraction of their strength. Young conscripts barely trained for battle were thrown into the city to hold lines for a few desperate days before being annihilated. Soviet commanders often resorted to human waves to blunt German advances, sending soldiers across open ground with little more than rifles or even shovels. Survivors spoke of charging while hearing the click of their political officer's pistol behind them, a reminder that retreat meant death either way. And yet, the Soviets endured. What sustained them was not only Stalin's ruthless discipline, but also a sense of duty born of despair. Civilians in German-occupied towns cursed the Red Army for abandoning them. Rumors spread of massacres and atrocities. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories circulated among Soviet soldiers, convincing them that surrender meant annihilation. To fight at Stalingrad was to fight for the very survival of their people. On the German side, frustration grew. Paulus had expected to take Stalingrad swiftly, but instead, his men bled for every kilometer. Hitler, watching from afar, grew restless and impatient. He berated his generals for their caution, demanding faster progress. In his mind, every delay was an affront, every hesitation a betrayal. He wanted the Volga, he wanted Stalin City, and he wanted it now. But the Wehrmacht was not fighting the same enemy it had crushed in 1941. The Soviet command was adapting. Stalin's order number 227, not one step back, was being enforced with brutal efficiency. Soviet troops had absorbed the lesson, fight or die, and increasingly the Germans were the ones paying for every advance in blood. The end of August brought a critical shift. Soviet High Command pulled the last remaining NKVD division from the south and rushed it north to reinforce collapsing sectors. The southern front weakened, creating an opening for Hoth. His panzers surged forward, advancing nearly 20 kilometers in a single thrust. Civilians fled in panic, clogging the streets with carts and bundles, only to be caught in the storm of artillery. For a moment, it seemed the German southern drive might split the city in two. But Soviet commanders, recognizing the danger, executed a fighting withdrawal. General Alexander Yeryomenko ordered his troops to fall back to hardened defenses within the city. Streets were barricaded, buildings fortified, and snipers stationed in every upper story. The Germans gained ground, but every step forward only bound them tighter into the labyrinth of Stalingrad itself. By the final days of August, the outline of the coming battle was clear. The Luftwaffe had devastated the city, but not broken its defenders. The Wehrmacht had reached the suburbs but not crushed Soviet resistance. Instead, the Germans had been dragged into a kind of war they had never wanted, a battle fought in rubble trenches and burning ruins, where tanks could not maneuver and artillery often killed as many friends as foes. The German Sixth Army had entered the jaws of the city, but it had not yet realized how those jaws would close. As September dawned, the German grip on Stalingrad tightened. Paulus's Sixth Army, though battered by disease exhaustion and stretched supply lines, pressed relentlessly forward. The encircled spearheads from August had been relieved after brutal fighting, and German lines gradually solidified. The Volga shimmered in the distance, tantalizingly close, and with every kilometer gained, the Germans felt they were closing the noose. On paper, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. By early September, they had seized large swaths of the northern suburbs and were pressing into the industrial districts. Yet the reality was far grimmer. Each block consumed entire battalions. A street gained today could be lost tomorrow. The city itself resisted, as if the stones and steel were conspiring against the invaders. It was at this stage that Stalin's master strategist, General Georgy Zhukov, entered the fight. A veteran of Moscow's defense, Zhukov was famed for his ruthless clarity. He understood that Stalingrad could not be held by static defense alone. Instead, he launched a counterattack in the north, attempting to cut German supply lines and encircle forward elements. His offensive struck with fury, forcing the Germans to divert divisions already stretched thin. Though the counterattack failed to achieve its ultimate goal, it succeeded in one critical respect. It forced the Germans to halt their momentum. German officers complained bitterly that instead of pressing deep into the city, they were tied down fending off Soviet assaults in the surrounding countryside. Every week, the battle dragged on, and every week, their logistical situation worsened. Meanwhile, Hitler's impatience boiled over. Frustrated by what he saw as dithering from his generals, he personally intervened. The commander of Army Group B was dismissed, and Hitler declared that he would take direct control of operations in the north. From far-off headquarters, he issued orders that ignored the realities on the ground, demanding renewed pushes, tighter encirclements, greater sacrifices. For those at the front, the orders felt detached from reality. To Hitler, war was arrows on a map. To the men in Stalingrad, it was hunger rubble and death. Inside the city, the situation for Soviet defenders grew dire. Two main armies, the 62nd under Vasily Chuikov and the 64th under Mikhail Shumilov, found themselves increasingly isolated. The Germans' relentless advance drove a wedge between them, cutting communication and reducing the flow of supplies. By September 9th, German units had reached the Volga, effectively splitting the Soviet defenses into fragments. For the 62nd Army, the river became both lifeline and graveyard. Supplies had to be ferried across under constant bombardment. German artillery and Luftwaffe aircraft raked the water, sinking barges and littering the surface with burning wreckage. Soldiers attempting to cross spoke of rowing through water so thick with oil and debris that it clung to their skin like tar. Many never reached the far shore. Those who did found themselves thrown immediately into combat. The 62nd Army was woefully under strength. Its only fully intact division was the NKVD Rifle Regiment transferred from the Southern Front. Every other unit was a patchwork of survivors, reserves, and raw recruits. Yet under Chuikov's command, they fought with a ferocity that stunned the Germans. Chuikov, a blunt and iron-willed commander, instructed his men to fight nose-to-nose with the enemy so close that German artillery and air support could not be used without hitting their own. This tactic, later known as the hugging defense, became the Soviets' salvation. In the chaos of ruined streets, where visibility was often no more than a few meters, soldiers clung to enemy positions, forcing brutal close-quarters combat. Germans accustomed to sweeping maneuvers and overwhelming firepower now found themselves battling in stairwells, basements, and collapsed rooms, bayonet against bayonet, knife against knife. The city itself seemed to devour armies. German tanks could not maneuver in the rubble. Snipers turned every window into a killing ground. Machine guns were set up in the shells of apartment blocks, firing down streets littered with corpses. Artillery pounded relentlessly, reducing whole districts to dust. But each bombardment only created new defensive positions for the Soviets. For civilians trapped inside, September was a descent into nightmare. Entire families lived underground, huddling in cellars while bombs shook the earth above. Food was scarce. People survived on horse meat, moldy bread, and whatever could be scavenged. Water was drawn from the Volga under fire. At night, the wounded groaned in makeshift hospitals with no medicine, no bandages, and no hope. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. German soldiers who had once believed in the inevitability of victory now wrote despairing letters home. One corporal described the fighting as hell itself, where the devil walks in every shadow. Soviet accounts reveal equal suffering, but also a grim determination. One Red Army private recalled, "We were told there was nowhere to retreat. Behind us was the Volga. Behind us was our country, so we stayed." By mid-September, the Germans had established partial encirclement of the city, tightening their grip like a vice. Yet every attempt to deliver the killing blow faltered. The Soviets, though battered, refused to yield. Each German advance was met with counterattacks, ambushes, and sniper fire. The Red Army, though seemingly at the brink, fought with the resilience of a people who had been told their survival as a nation depended on this single city. September closed with Stalingrad transformed. What had once been a bustling industrial hub was now a shattered wasteland. Entire neighborhoods no longer existed, reduced to smoldering craters. The Volga flowed thick with debris and the bodies of the drowned. German flags rose over captured districts, but Soviet resistance burned in every corner still held. And in the shadows of this devastation, something larger was forming. In Moscow, Stalin and his generals were already conceiving a counterstroke, a storm that would one day sweep across the steppe. For now, the Germans could not see it. All they knew was that Stalingrad had not fallen, and every day it held was another nail in the coffin of Hitler's grand design. By early September, the German 6th Army had broken through Stalingrad's outer defenses. On September 9th, the 29th Motorized Division became the first major German formation to reach the southern banks of the Volga. For the first time, the river lay within direct sight of Hitler's armies. The long-sought objective seemed within their grasp. But Stalingrad was not a city that could be taken by storm. It was a sprawl of factories, warehouses, apartment blocks, and rail lines threaded with narrow alleys and stairwells filled with civilians who refused to leave. The Luftwaffe's relentless bombing campaign had not erased the city but had twisted it into something far worse. A battlefield of jagged ruins where every wall was a barricade, every cellar a bunker. For the Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies, this transformation was both curse and salvation. The two formations had been cut off from each other by the German advance, and the 62nd under General Vasily Chuikov was left with a trickle of supplies ferried across the Volga. Boats moved at night under constant fire, carrying ammunition rations and reinforcements. Many never reached the shore, torn apart by artillery shells or swallowed by the burning river. Those who did arrive were thrown immediately into the inferno, often with barely a rifle between them. Chuikov, a grizzled and iron-willed commander, understood that his only hope lay in turning Stalingrad into a grinder. He ordered his men to cling to the German lines, never giving them space to breathe. This tactic, what he called hugging the enemy, meant that German artillery and Luftwaffe bombers could not unleash their full firepower without hitting their own troops. It forced the fighting into brutal proximity, room to room, stairwell to stairwell, courtyard to courtyard. German soldiers who had once fought sweeping campaigns across open plains now found themselves crawling through rubble, their tanks trapped in streets too narrow or too broken to maneuver. Engineers blasted holes through walls to advance from house to house, while Soviet defenders used the same ruins as nests for snipers and ambushes. One German officer later recalled, "We conquered half a city in a day in France. Here we conquer half a room." The city itself seemed to swallow men whole. Smoke from fires hung low, choking lungs and stinging eyes. The roar of artillery echoed constantly, mingled with the crack of rifles and the screams of the wounded. The smell of burning wood, flesh, and oil clung to everything. At night, shadows moved among the ruins, Soviet soldiers slipping through alleys, knives in hand, cutting down sentries. For civilians, life was no less brutal. Many had been conscripted into digging trenches, carrying ammunition, or building barricades. Women and children ferried water under sniper fire or scavenged for food in the ruins of bombed-out warehouses. Some took up arms themselves, defending their own homes alongside soldiers. A Soviet factory worker later described how his brigade finished assembling tanks under bombardment, drove them straight out of the factory doors and into combat within the city streets. The Germans, though technically advancing, began to feel the strain. Their superiority in tanks and air power mattered little in the ruins. Every victory was Pyrrhic, an apartment block captured at the cost of dozens of men, a factory floor taken only after days of bloodshed. The Luftwaffe rained bombs endlessly, but instead of clearing resistance, the bombardments turned the city into an even stronger fortress of debris. By September 13th, the Germans launched their first major assault into the heart of Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe opened with another bombardment joined by the thunder of heavy artillery. The ground shook as whole districts were pulverized. Then the infantry moved in, advancing into the smoking ruins. The Soviets fought with a savagery that stunned even hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. Chuykov's men fought not just to hold ground, but to bleed the Germans at every step. Snipers turned every window into a death trap. Machine gun nests hidden in rubble raked advancing infantry. Mines grenades and Molotov cocktails were deployed at every opportunity. Soviet soldiers coined the phrase "the city of knives" to describe the combat intimate, constant, and merciless. German gains were real but fragile. They captured several key rail stations, pressing deep into the center of the city. They seized high ground overlooking the Volga positions from which they could rain fire on Soviet supply crossings. At times, it seemed as though Stalingrad would finally collapse under the pressure. Yet each breakthrough was countered by desperate Soviet counterattacks. Reinforcements ferried across the river under shell fire charged directly into the battle. Often, they had no time to orient themselves, no time to rest before being thrown into combat. Many never even fired a shot before being cut down, but their presence alone slowed the German advance. Chuykov's strategy of proximity defense forced the Germans into ceaseless close-quarters fighting. Soldiers wrestled in stairwells, stabbing with bayonets, choking each other with bare hands. Grenades were rolled down hallways. Mortars fired at point-blank range. The boundaries between front and rear dissolved entirely. A German soldier could be eating rations in a captured building one moment, only to be attacked by Soviet troops emerging from a hidden basement the next. For Paulus's 6th Army, the city became a nightmare. They were trained for maneuver warfare, for sweeping encirclements and rapid advances. Stalingrad reduced them to squads fighting over single rooms. Entire regiments were drained, capturing a single factory floor, only to face counterattacks that drove them back the next day. By the end of September, the Germans had reached the heart of Stalingrad, but at a terrible cost. 2/3 of the city was in their hands, but the Soviets still held vital pockets along the Volga. Supplies continued to trickle across under fire, keeping the 62nd Army alive. And though the Germans did not know it, every day spent bleeding in the city was one more day for the Soviets to prepare the storm gathering beyond the horizon. Stalin and his generals were already planning a counteroffensive, massing reserves in secret. The Germans believed they were grinding down their enemy. In truth, they were exhausting themselves in a trap from which there would be no escape. For now, though, the soldiers on both sides knew only the ruined streets, the constant thunder of guns, and the suffocating smell of death. Stalingrad had become not just a city, but a furnace consuming all who entered. On September 13th, 1942, the Germans hurled themselves into the city with full force. For weeks, they had fought to breach the suburbs, clawing their way through rubble, but now they aimed for the city's beating heart. The assault opened with another deafening barrage. The Luftwaffe pounded Stalingrad from the skies, while German heavy artillery hammered it from the ground. The combination created what survivors described as a metallic earthquake, walls vibrating the air, splitting the sky itself, flashing with fire. When the bombardment lifted, the infantry surged forward. Across the city center, gray-coated soldiers poured into the ruins, pushing through clouds of dust and smoke. They encountered resistance immediately. Chuykov's 62nd Army, reinforced by desperate ferries across the Volga, met them head-on. The Soviets knew they could not match German firepower, but they compensated with ferocity and proximity. They clung to the invaders like shadows, engaging at such close range that German gunners hesitated to fire for fear of killing their own comrades. The fighting in mid-September reached a new level of intensity. Rail yards became killing grounds where locomotives served as bunkers. German infantry stormed the central railway station 3 times in a single day, and 3 times Soviet defenders drove them back. By nightfall, the station had changed hands no fewer than a dozen times. When dawn came, it was little more than twisted steel and corpses. Elsewhere, the Germans seized key high ground overlooking the Volga, giving them vantage points to rain fire on Soviet supply crossings. It was a serious blow. Barges ferrying ammunition rations and fresh soldiers now faced withering artillery fire. Many never made it across. The riverbanks became littered with wreckage bodies and burning fuel. Still, the ferries continued night after night because, without them, the 62nd Army would cease to exist. For the soldiers fighting in the ruins, the city was no longer recognizable. Streets once lined with shops and apartments were reduced to charred shells. Basements became shelters. Sewers became avenues of movement. Stairwells became battlefields. One German lieutenant described the experience in a letter. "We advance. One house in the morning, lose it by noon. Retake it in the evening. Every wall is a fortress. Every cellar is a tomb." Chuikov's tactics of hugging the enemy reached their full expression during these days. Soviet troops stayed so close to German positions that air support and artillery were nearly useless. In some sectors, the two armies were separated by only the width of a wall. Soldiers would shout insults through cracks in the plaster, or hear the enemy coughing in the next room. At night, they could smell each other's cooking fires. It was a war without distance, fought within touching range. The psychological toll was immense. German units accustomed to maneuver warfare found themselves trapped in a nightmare of constant ambushes. Snipers picked them off from shattered factories. Mines lay hidden in rubble. Soviet soldiers tunneled beneath ruins to emerge behind German lines. A machine gun nest silenced at dawn might erupt again at dusk, manned by a fresh squad that had crawled across the river under fire. By September 14th, the Germans pressed deep into the city center. They captured key buildings, including the post office and several government offices, and began driving toward the Volga. Soviet resistance bent but did not break. Chuikov himself directed operations from a bunker dug into the riverbank, the roof quaking with every German shell. His headquarters was so close to the front that he could smell cordite in the air. On September 15th and 16th, the Germans achieved one of their most significant gains. After ferocious combat, they seized hills overlooking the central districts, including Mamayev Kurgan, a commanding height from which artillery could dominate the city. The Red Army counterattacked with everything it had, storming the slopes in waves. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand among craters filled with corpses. For days, control of the hill shifted back and forth, until finally the Germans held it, though, at such cost that their divisions were shadows of their former strength. Yet, the Soviets were not finished. Even as they lost ground, they launched counter-barrages with Katyusha rockets filling the sky with shrieking trails of fire. German officers described the sensation as facing the howling of demons. The rockets destroyed buildings, churned rubble, and shattered morale. For the defenders of Stalingrad, they were both a weapon and a rallying cry, proof that the city still lived, still fought back. The brutality of this phase defies comprehension. A single-grain elevator fortified by a handful of Soviet soldiers held off repeated German assaults for 4 days. The defenders, armed with little more than rifles and grenades, fought until their ammunition was gone, then hurled rocks and debris. When the Germans finally overran the position, only a few Soviet fighters remained gaunt and bloodied, still defiant. Stories like these circulated among the Red Army, inspiring further resistance. Civilians whispered them to one another in shelters. German soldiers, meanwhile, were shaken by the refusal of their enemies to surrender even in hopeless situations. What they had expected to be a rapid conquest had become a nightmare of attrition. By September 18th, the Germans had advanced to within striking distance of the Volga itself. For a moment, victory seemed tantalizingly close. Hitler proclaimed that Stalingrad was nearly in his grasp. But inside the city, the Soviets still held pockets of resistance clinging to factories, apartments, and bunkers. Then, on September 16th, the Soviets struck back with fury. Counterattacks retook critical high ground in the city center, denying the Germans full control. It was a bitter blow. One German general, von Wiedersheim, suggested that the campaign might fail, that the army should consider withdrawing to more defensible positions. For his candor, he was dismissed. Hitler would not hear of retreat. As the days wore on, even symbols of resistance emerged. Soldiers fortified an ordinary apartment block, turning it into a fortress that came to be known as Pavlov's house. For 60 days, a small garrison held out against constant German assaults, repelling tanks and infantry with mines, grenades, and sheer determination. To the Soviets, it became a legend, a microcosm of Stalingrad itself, unyielding against impossible odds. By the end of September, the Germans controlled roughly 2/3 of the city. Their banners flew over central districts, their artillery commanded the Volga's banks. But the price had been staggering. Divisions were hollowed out, soldiers were exhausted, and still, the Soviets clung to the ruins. Stalingrad had not fallen. It was bleeding, burning, suffocating, but it was alive. And as long as the Soviets held even a sliver of the riverbank, as long as ferries crossed under fire, as long as soldiers like those in Pavlov's house fought on, the city could not be declared conquered. The Germans did not yet realize it, but they were caught in a trap of their own making. What was meant to be a quick blow had become a war of annihilation. Every day inside Stalingrad drained their strength, while beyond the horizon, Stalin and Zhukov were preparing something far more terrible. For now, though, the streets echoed with gunfire, the nights burned with fire, and the Volga ran red. The battle had entered its most savage phase, and there would be no turning back. By late September, Stalingrad was no longer a functioning city. It was a carcass of smoking ruins where life clung stubbornly amid death. 2/3 of the city lay in German hands, yet the Soviets refused to yield. Even as German banners flew over government buildings and factories, pockets of resistance fought on, each a thorn in the invader's side. Out of these desperate stands, legends were born. One such legend was the grain elevator. On the southern edge of the city, a group of Soviet soldiers fortified a towering concrete silo. Inside, the defenders had little more than rifles, machine guns, and a dwindling supply of grenades. Yet for days, they held back waves of German assaults. Tanks rolled up to the structure, blasting holes in its walls. Infantry stormed the entrances, only to be driven back by a hail of fire. The Germans were bewildered by the stubbornness of the defense. To them, it was just a storage place for grain hardly worth the blood being spilled. But to the Soviets, it became a symbol. The grain inside was life itself, food for their starving comrades. To abandon it would be to abandon hope. For 4 days, the defenders fought until their ammunition was gone, then fought on with bayonets, shovels, even stones. When the Germans finally overran the elevator, they found only a handful of survivors, gaunt, exhausted, but unbroken. Stories like this spread rapidly across the front. To the Soviets, they were rallying cries, proof that Stalingrad was not lost. To the Germans, they were ominous reminders that the enemy would not collapse as expected. Even more enduring was the tale of Pavlov's house. In late September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small detachment of Red Army soldiers seized a 4-story apartment block overlooking a square. Recognizing its strategic importance, they fortified it with barbed wire mines and machine gun nests. From its windows, they commanded fields of fire across several streets, preventing German armor and infantry from advancing. The Germans launched repeated assaults, bringing tanks and artillery against the building. Each time, the defenders drove them back. Pavlov's men reinforced the walls with sandbags and rubble, turning apartments into bunkers. Civilians still living in the building assisted by carrying water cooking and even reloading rifles. At night, supplies and reinforcements were ferried across the Volga, crawling through darkness to reach the garrison. What began as a desperate stand turned into a 60-day siege within the larger siege of Stalingrad. German soldiers nicknamed the strongpoint the Fortress and cursed it in their diaries. Soviet propaganda celebrated it as a miniature Stalingrad. a handful of men defying an army. Later, when the city was liberated, Pavlov was decorated as a hero of the Soviet Union, his house immortalized as a monument. For the men inside, however, it was not glory, but survival. Conditions were horrific. Ammunition was rationed, food was scarce. Wounded men were treated in darkened basements with no medicine. Yet the defenders held their determination, encapsulating the spirit of the entire city. The Germans, despite controlling most of Stalingrad by the end of September, could not crush these strongpoints. Each demanded time, men, and ammunition they could scarcely spare. Paulus's 6th Army had advanced deep into the ruins, but every step forward had cost blood. His divisions were bleeding out their replacements too few, their supply lines stretched to breaking. For the Soviets, reinforcement was still possible. Across the Volga, fresh units continued to arrive, ferried under cover of darkness and smoke. Many never made it. Boats capsized, burned, or sank under artillery fire. But those who did cross immediately stiffened the defenses. Zhukov hurled them into the fight without pause, knowing that each new body, each new rifle prolonged the defense. As September drew to a close, the weather began to shift. The winds grew colder, the nights sharper. Veterans of the Eastern Front knew what that meant. General winter was coming. For the Germans, already starved of fuel and supplies, the prospect was grim. For the Soviets, it was hope. Winter had saved Moscow the year before. Perhaps it would save Stalingrad now. Meanwhile, Stalin and his high command were not idle. In utmost secrecy, they prepared something far greater than mere defense. While the Germans bled themselves dry in the ruins, Soviet generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky gathered reserves on the steppe. Entire armies were being assembled beyond the horizon, their presence hidden by deception and camouflage. Trucks rumbled through the night, bringing tanks, artillery, and fresh divisions to staging grounds far from the city. The Soviets were crafting a counteroffensive that would change the course of the war. Inside Stalingrad, none of this was known. For the soldiers and civilians trapped within September ended as it had begun, with fire rubble and endless combat. The Germans controlled perhaps 2/3 of the city, but the Soviets still held the factories, and riverbanks still ferried supplies across the Volga, still clung to ruins like Pavlov's house. For Paulus's men, the city had become a labyrinth of death. German soldiers who once dreamed of swift conquest now dreaded every street corner. A burned-out tram could conceal a machine gun nest. A collapsed building could hide snipers. An ordinary apartment block could turn into another Pavlov's house. Letters captured from German troops revealed despair. We are not fighting men, but devils. Every ruin has a soul, and every soul shoots at us. Stalingrad had become more than a battle. It was a contest of wills, a struggle in which symbols mattered as much as territory. To Hitler, the city's name made it a prize he could not relinquish. To Stalin, its defense was proof that the Soviet Union would not yield. To the men who fought there, it was nothing less than survival. As October loomed, both sides braced for the next stage. The Germans believed a final push would break Soviet resistance. The Soviets, battered and bloodied, believed that holding even a sliver of the city meant victory. And beyond the horizon, unseen, a storm was gathering that would engulf them all. October 1942 arrived with icy winds sweeping across the Volga. The smoke that had choked Stalingrad for weeks now mingled with the first chills of autumn, carrying a promise of the winter to come. The Germans still believed the city would soon collapse, but inside the ruins, the Soviets continued to resist with a ferocity that defied logic. The focus of the battle shifted to the city's industrial heartland, massive complexes of steelworks, tractor factories, and chemical plants. These were not just factories, they were fortresses. The Luftwaffe had bombed them mercilessly, collapsing walls, twisting steel, and turning workshops into labyrinths of rubble. Yet the very destruction made them stronger for defense. Collapsed girders became barricades, half-ruined workshops became machine gun nests, and assembly lines became trenches. For the Germans, every meter was agony. The advance slowed to a crawl. An entire company might spend a day clearing a single building only to face a counterattack that reclaimed it by night. Soldiers grew accustomed to fighting in a surreal landscape amid shattered blast furnaces between skeletal cranes inside half-assembled tractors that doubled as cover. The Luftwaffe, which had once been Germany's most fearsome weapon, now betrayed its own side. Every fresh bombing run pulverized the city further, but instead of wiping out the defenders, it created more rubble for them to hide in. German tank commanders cursed the air raids, their vehicles bogged down in debris, unable to maneuver, and streets turned into jagged canyons of stone and steel. The Soviets turned the ruins into death traps. Snipers, most famously Vasily Zaitsev, made the factories their hunting grounds. From concealed positions, they picked off German officers, machine gunners, and anyone foolish enough to expose themselves. Zaitsev, who would become a legend, taught his comrades to move constantly to conceal themselves among wreckage and to use decoys to lure targets. German soldiers spoke of the city as haunted, where the very bricks have eyes. The fighting was relentless, intimate, and merciless. Soldiers described it as Rattenkrieg, a rat's war. Grenades rolled down staircases, flamethrowers swept through corridors, bayonets flashed in the darkness. Basements were stormed with hand-to-hand combat, only to be retaken hours later. Neither side gave quarter. Prisoners were rare. Most were killed where they stood. Inside the Red October steel plant battles raged floor by floor. The Germans stormed one hall only to find Soviets waiting in ambush in the next. When ammunition ran low, defenders used hammers and iron bars torn from the factory's machines. One worker turned soldier recalled, "We fought with the tools of our trade. Yesterday I used this hammer to build. Today I use it to kill." The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory became another fortress. Incredibly, while shells fell around them, workers continued assembling tanks. New machines rolled straight off the assembly line into battle, sometimes with factory workers still aboard to man their guns. The Germans, stunned, reported facing tanks that emerged from the very earth of Stalingrad itself. Civilians remained part of the struggle. Women and children carried ammunition, water, and food to frontline positions. Many lived in cellars beneath the factories, enduring constant bombardment. They became part of the defense not by choice, but by necessity. To leave meant death. To stay meant survival through defiance. For the Germans, October was a month of frustration. Hitler had demanded results. Stalingrad must fall. Paulus's Sixth Army obeyed, launching one assault after another, but each came at staggering cost. By October 4th, Paulus reported that some of his corps had lost offensive capability entirely. Units that began the battle with thousands of men were now reduced to mere hundreds. Yet still the orders came: advance attack, crush the city. The 4th Panzer Army under Hoth renewed its drive, pushing through southern districts and reaching the Volga by mid-October. For a moment, it seemed the final blow was near. Soviet defenders were pushed into ever-shrinking pockets along the riverbank. The 62nd Army, clinging desperately to the shoreline, had only fragments of divisions left. Ammunition was scarce, rations almost non-existent. Men fought on empty stomachs, drinking water laced with ash and oil from the Volga. But the Germans, too, were running on fumes. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. Horses collapsed along the routes wagons mired in mud. Fuel was scarce, ammunition deliveries sporadic. Winter's shadow grew longer, and with it came fear. Soldiers muttered about General Winter, the enemy that had humbled Napoleon and stalled the Wehrmacht the year before. The industrial sector became a graveyard for both armies. Buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. Entire regiments melted away into the ruins, leaving behind only charred helmets and shattered rifles. The Germans paid dearly for every inch, while the Soviets bled endlessly to hold their ground. Neither side would admit defeat. By late October, it was clear that the city would not fall easily. Paulus's reports grew grim. Casualties mounted morale, frayed, and yet the Soviets refused to die. Hitler, furious at the delays, demanded renewed assaults. His obsession with capturing Stalingrad blinded him to the reality that the battle had already consumed the flower of the Sixth Army. And still beyond the city, the Soviets prepared. For weeks, Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky had been planning something larger than mere survival. Reinforcements massed on the steppe under cover of deception. Armies hidden in the vastness of Russia were waiting for the signal to strike. For the Germans in the factories, this was invisible. All they knew was that the city consumed them. In letters home, soldiers wrote of nightmares, where walls whispered, where shadows carried knives, where every ruin concealed another ambush. They had come to conquer a city, but found themselves prisoners within it. October closed with the Germans pushing into the industrial heart, but failing to break the Soviet spirit. The ruins of the steelworks and tractor factory stood as monuments of defiance, jagged and blackened against the autumn sky. The Soviets still held the riverbanks. The ferries still crossed under fire. The city battered, but breathing refused to fall. And as the first snowflakes drifted down upon the ruins, the furnace of Stalingrad prepared to erupt into something even more catastrophic. For the Germans, the worst was yet to come. By November, the Germans believed Stalingrad was theirs. 2/3 of the city was under their control, their banners flying from rooftops and factories. The Sixth Army had fought its way into the industrial district, grinding down Soviet resistance block by block. The Volga crossings were under constant artillery fire, reducing ferries to burning wrecks. The 62nd Army clung to little more than a strip of shoreline and a scattering of ruins. From a distance, the city looked conquered, but appearances were deceiving. Though the Soviets held only 10% of Stalingrad, that sliver was enough. Barges still crossed at night, bringing reinforcements and supplies under a storm of fire. The defenders were bloodied but alive. More importantly, beyond the city, the Red Army was preparing something far larger than survival. For months, Stalin's high command had been working in utmost secrecy. While German divisions bled in the ruins, Soviet generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky gathered reserves across the steppe. Entire armies, men, tanks, artillery, and aircraft were quietly shifted into position on the flanks north and south of Stalingrad. These were not raw recruits, but hardened formations many held back from earlier battles for just this moment. Operation Uranus was its name, a counteroffensive designed to encircle the Germans and their allies, cutting off the Sixth Army and crushing it in place. The plan was audacious, even reckless. It relied on deception, timing, and the weakness of Germany's allies. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions stretched thin along the flanks. These men, poorly equipped and less motivated, were expected to hold vast sectors of front. Against the storm about to fall on them, they were little more than kindling. While the Soviets prepared their trap, the defenders inside Stalingrad continued to fight with desperate resilience. Chuikov's 62nd Army had been reduced to fragments of divisions, their men fighting from cellars, basements, and sewers. Yet their resistance served a greater purpose. They fixed the 6th Army in place, keeping Paulus's divisions locked in combat and unable to redeploy. Every soldier who died amid the ruins bought time for Zhukov's hammer to fall. Life for those still clinging to the city was apocalyptic. Soldiers lived underground in bunkers carved into the riverbank, their walls trembling with each German shell. Civilians who had not been evacuated huddled in cellars, sharing scraps of bread and melted snow. The dead lay unburied, frozen into the rubble as the first frosts arrived. Hunger gnawed at everyone. Men fought on empty stomachs, too weak to stand for long, but still they held rifles, still they fired. And across the Volga, the Soviet buildup grew. Trains rumbled by night, their cargoes of men and steel concealed beneath camouflage netting. Villagers along the steppe saw endless convoys of trucks and tanks moving east to west, the earth itself trembling under their wheels. Soviet propaganda called it the secret tide, a gathering storm that the Germans could not see. The Germans, for their part, were blind to the danger. Hitler and his generals in Berlin focused on the city itself, obsessed with capturing the last Soviet strongholds along the river. Paulus's reports were grim casualties, soaring units exhausted. But Hitler demanded victory, demanded Stalingrad be taken at any cost. He dismissed intelligence that hinted at Soviet concentrations beyond the flanks. To him, the Red Army was nearly broken, incapable of mounting a major offensive. The obsession with the city's symbolic value blinded him to the strategic reality. Inside Stalingrad, symbols mattered just as much as strategy. Pavlov's house still stood a fortress of defiance. The Red October and Barricade factories still clung to Soviet hands. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev turned ruins into hunting grounds, their exploits celebrated in Pravda and whispered among the defenders. These stories fueled morale, giving exhausted men reasons to fight another day. By mid-November, the Germans could sense winter's approach. Snow fell across the ruins, covering corpses and craters alike. The Volga froze at its edges, making crossings even more treacherous. German soldiers shivered in thin uniforms, cursing the cold. Supply lines already stretched to breaking grew more fragile with each frost. Horses died on the steppe roads. Fuel froze in barrels. Men warmed their hands over burning scraps of wood, muttering about General Winter returning to take his toll. Still, the assaults continued. Paulus launched fresh attacks against the industrial zone, seeking to seize the last Soviet strongholds. His divisions advanced meter by meter, paying for every step with blood. By November 11th, the Soviets held little more than isolated pockets in factories and apartment blocks. One German officer wrote home that the Red Army was finished, that Stalingrad would soon fall. But in Moscow, Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky knew better. They had chosen their moment carefully. The Germans were exhausted, their flanks weak, their supply lines brittle. The Soviets had gathered over 1 million men, nearly 1,000 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and more than 1,000 aircraft. The trap was ready. All that remained was the signal. On November 19, 1942, before dawn, the silence of the steppe was broken by the roar of artillery. Thousands of guns opened fire in unison, shattering the frozen earth. The counteroffensive had begun. Inside Stalingrad, the defenders heard the thunder and felt the ground tremble. For men who had lived for months in despair, it was a sound like salvation. They did not yet know the details, but they sensed the tide was turning. Their city had endured long enough. Now it was the Germans' turn to face the storm. At precisely 7:20 a.m. on November 19, 1942, the silence of the frozen steppe shattered. More than 500 Soviet guns and mortars unleashed their fury in a synchronized barrage. The ground shook as shells screamed overhead, detonating along the Romanian front lines north of Stalingrad. Snow and soil erupted into the air, trenches collapsed, and men were buried alive. For the Axis allies guarding Germany's flanks, the apocalypse had arrived. This was Operation Uranus, the counterstroke Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky had planned for months. Its aim was not merely to relieve Stalingrad, but to encircle the entire German 6th Army and their supporting divisions. The Soviets had massed more than 1 million men, nearly 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of aircraft for the assault. Against them stood exhausted Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians, poorly armed, poorly clothed for winter, and already demoralized from months of fighting. The Soviet advance was overwhelming. T-34 tanks, their engines warmed by bonfires under frozen oil pans, roared across the snow. Infantry surged forward in waves, bayonets glinting in the weak winter sun. Romanian defenses collapsed almost immediately. Entire regiments broke and fled, leaving their positions undefended. German officers begged for reinforcements, but Paulus had none to spare. Every division was locked inside the city, fighting Chuykov's 62nd Army for a handful of factories and streets. For the German soldiers inside Stalingrad, the thunder of the barrage carried like a distant storm. At first, they thought it was simply another Soviet counterattack. But within hours, reports trickled in. The flanks were breaking Romanian units, annihilated Soviet tanks pouring through the gaps. Still, Paulus reassured his men. Surely this was only a localized assault. Surely the lines would hold. They did not. Over the next 3 days, the Red Army advanced more than 50 kilometers, punching deep into Axis rear areas. By November 22nd, Soviet armored spearheads from the north and south met at the town of Kalash on the Don River, slamming the trap shut. The encirclement was complete. More than 300,000 German soldiers, along with thousands of Romanians and Croatians, were trapped inside Stalingrad. For Paulus, the situation was catastrophic. His 6th Army, already battered and undersupplied, was now completely surrounded. The Volga lay to the east, blocked by Soviet artillery. To the west, Soviet armies formed a solid wall. Supplies could no longer arrive by land. Escape routes were gone. He faced a grim choice: attempt an immediate breakout, or dig in and wait for relief. Paulus requested permission to withdraw to break out before the Soviet ring solidified. But Hitler's response was chillingly predictable. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad will be held. To retreat in Hitler's eyes was unthinkable. The city that bore Stalin's name had become a symbol of prestige. To abandon it would be an admission of defeat, not just in battle, but in ideology. Hitler's decision sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. Instead of retreating while escape was possible, the Germans dug in amid the ruins, awaiting salvation from outside. High command in Berlin placed its faith in the Luftwaffe. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring assured Hitler that the trapped army could be supplied entirely by air. He promised to deliver 500 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition per day. The promise was a fantasy. In reality, the Luftwaffe could barely deliver a fraction of that, and even then only at staggering cost. At first, the airlift seemed possible. Cargo planes landed on improvised airstrips, unloading supplies and evacuating wounded. But winter deepened. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, and anti-aircraft fire turned every flight into a gamble. Planes were shot down in flames, their wrecks littering the steppe. Others froze on runways, engines refusing to start in sub-zero temperatures. The daily tonnage delivered rarely exceeded 100 tons, barely enough to sustain a single course, let alone an entire army. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Rations were slashed. Bread was bulked with sawdust. Soldiers slaughtered their horses for meat, then boiled the bones into soup. Fuel was so scarce that tanks sat immobilized, their crews reduced to fighting as infantry. Medical supplies vanished. Wounded men lay untreated in freezing shelters, their breath forming icicles on their beards. The Soviets tightened the noose. Artillery rained on German positions daily, while Soviet patrols harassed the perimeter. Soviet propaganda leaflets fluttered down from the sky, urging surrender. Some German soldiers, too weak to resist, slipped into captivity. Most held on grimly, hoping for relief. The scale of the disaster became clear even to Paulus. His once proud army was shrinking by the day. Frostbite disease and starvation claimed more lives than Soviet bullets. Morale collapsed. Letters from soldiers revealed despair. "We are abandoned. We wait for death. Our Führer has forgotten us." Meanwhile, outside the pocket, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was tasked with organizing a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm. He gathered divisions from across the front, preparing to break through and rescue the Sixth Army. But the distance was vast, the Soviets entrenched and time short. For Paulus's men, the encirclement marked the beginning of a slow death. They had entered Stalingrad in the heat of summer, their banners bright, their confidence unshaken. Now winter cloaked the ruins and hope grew colder by the day. Inside the Soviet camp, the mood was transformed. Soldiers who had fought desperately for survival now sensed victory. For months, they had been told to hold on to buy time, and now they understood why. The encirclement was proof that their suffering had not been in vain. The Germans, once invincible, were trapped like prey. As snowstorms swept across the steppe and the Volga froze into a sheet of ice, the roles had reversed. The hunters had become the unhunted. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, Paulus's Sixth Army awaited either salvation or destruction. As the jaws of encirclement snapped shut around Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army looked to the sky for salvation. Surrounded by over 1 million Soviet troops with no land route open, their only hope of survival lay in the promise made by Hermann Göring and the Luftwaffe. The army would be supplied entirely by air. To Hitler, the idea was intoxicating. If the Luftwaffe could keep 300,000 men alive in the ruins of Stalingrad, the city could remain in German hands indefinitely. More importantly, Hitler would not need to admit defeat or order retreat. The propaganda value was enormous proof he believed of German mastery of logistics and technology. Göring assured him the Luftwaffe could deliver at least 500 tons of supplies per day, more than enough to sustain the army until a relief operation arrived. The reality was starkly different. Even under ideal conditions, the Luftwaffe could deliver no more than 300 tons per day, and that figure was a fantasy on paper. Winter weather Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighter patrols made every mission perilous. In truth, the average daily delivery would struggle to reach 100 tons, barely a quarter of what Paulus's starving army required. At first, the airlift seemed workable. Cargo planes, mainly Ju-52 transports, and Heinkel bombers converted for supply landed at airfields, within the pocket offloading crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Wounded soldiers were loaded onto stretchers and flown out, their gaunt faces pressed against frosted windows as they left the inferno behind. For those still in Stalingrad, the departing planes became symbols of hope, proof that Berlin had not forgotten them. But within days, the flaws became apparent. The volume of supplies was pitiful. Soldiers received bread rations cut to 200 grams per day, barely enough to sustain a child, let alone a fighting man in sub-zero temperatures. Flour was mixed with sawdust to stretch it further. Meat came only from slaughtered horses, their carcasses dragged from frozen streets. Fuel was scarcer still. Tanks lay immobile, their engines silent, while soldiers huddled inside them for warmth. The Soviets understood the importance of the airlift and made it their mission to strangle it. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, ambushing transport planes. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the perimeter, forcing pilots to fly higher and more erratically, reducing accuracy and volume of drops. Many flights never reached Stalingrad at all. Wrecks of Ju-52s and Heinkels littered the steppe, their crews frozen beside them. Those planes that did make it often delivered the wrong supplies. Logistics broke down under the strain. Crates of condoms, summer uniforms, and even champagne reportedly arrived while frontline soldiers begged for bread boots and bullets. Paulus fumed, his reports growing increasingly desperate, but Hitler clung to the illusion. The Sixth Army will hold, he declared. It will be supplied by air. For the men on the ground, survival became a daily torment. They stripped wallpaper from ruined apartments, boiling the paste for soup. They collected horse fat in jars, rationing it spoonful by spoonful. Men gnawed at frozen carcasses, sometimes cutting strips of flesh from animals already half rotted. One soldier wrote, "We are reduced to beasts scavenging in the ruins, gnawing bones like dogs." The wounded fared worst. Hospitals overflowed, their corridors lined with men missing limbs, their wounds festering for lack of bandages. Doctors operated without anesthesia, sawing through bone as patients screamed. Fuel shortages meant that tents erected for the wounded were left unheated. Men froze to death on stretchers as snow drifted through gaps in the canvas. Discipline began to erode. Soldiers fought over crusts of bread, raided supply depots, and bartered away ammunition for food. Commanders struggled to maintain order, threatening courts-martial that few still feared. The promise of the airlift, once a lifeline, had become a cruel joke. The Soviets exploited the misery with psychological warfare. Loudspeakers blared across no man's land, broadcasting messages. "Paulus, your men are starving. The Luftwaffe cannot save you. Surrender and live." Leaflets fluttered from the sky, showing pictures of prisoners being fed, clothed, and treated. Many Germans dismissed them as lies, but the seed of doubt spread. And still, Hitler refused to allow breakout. Paulus pleaded repeatedly, "Permit me to attempt withdrawal before it is too late." Each request was denied. To Hitler, the Sixth Army must hold Stalingrad at all costs. The city was more than a military objective. It was a symbol of his duel with Stalin. To abandon it would be to admit weakness. Better, he believed, that the Sixth Army perish than retreat. The suffering deepened with each passing day. Frostbite claimed thousands, blackening fingers and toes until they snapped off like sticks. Dysentery spread through the ranks as soldiers drank melted snow tainted with ash and human waste. Corpses froze in grotesque postures, stacked like firewood outside bunkers, because there was no time or energy to bury them. By December, the men of the Sixth Army were shadows of themselves. They marched on swollen feet, their eyes sunken, their uniforms rags, yet still they fought, clinging to the ruins, waiting for relief that never came. For the Soviets, the airlift was proof of German desperation. Red Army soldiers watched the cargo planes circle overhead, jeering at the idea that an army could be fed through the sky. They joked grimly that the Germans were living on clouds. In reality, the Sixth Army was dying on the ground. The illusion of the airlift was not just a logistical failure, it was a psychological trap. It convinced Hitler to forbid retreat. It convinced Paulus to wait rather than act. It bound 300,000 men to the ruins of Stalingrad, condemning them to starvation and death. The sky that once promised salvation had become a graveyard of burning planes and broken promises. And as December drew near, the Soviets prepared their next move, while the Germans, huddled in their frozen shelters, whispered of relief that would never arrive. By December 1942, the Sixth Army inside Stalingrad was starving, freezing, and losing men by the tens of thousands. Yet Hitler refused to allow Paulus to break out. Instead, he placed hope in a relief operation led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the man he trusted to turn disaster into victory. The plan, called Operation Winter Storm, was simple on paper: strike from the southwest with fresh divisions, break through Soviet lines, and relieve the encircled army before it was too late. On December 12th, the operation began. German tanks of the 4th Panzer Army rumbled forward across the frozen steppe, their engines straining in the cold. Soldiers cheered as they advanced, believing they were on their way to rescue their trapped comrades. Morale surged briefly. This was the long-awaited salvation. At first, progress was encouraging. The German spearheads advanced up to 50 kilometers, pushing back Soviet defenses. They captured villages, seized bridges, and for a moment it seemed the tide might turn. Paulus and his staff, listening to reports from inside Stalingrad, allowed themselves cautious hope. Relief was less than 50 kilometers away, so close that trapped soldiers could hear distant artillery from Manstein's offensive. Inside the pocket, the prospect of rescue spread like wildfire. Emaciated men whispered to one another, "Manstein is coming. Hold on a little longer." Soldiers who had resigned themselves to death found flickers of hope. Some even began to ration what little food they had, preparing to survive long enough to greet their rescuers. But hope is fragile in war. The Soviets, far from collapsing, struck back with ferocity. Stalin and Zhukov had anticipated the relief attempt. Even as Manstein advanced, fresh Soviet armies launched counterattacks along the flanks, forcing him to divert strength to defense. The icy winds of the steppe battered the advancing columns. Fuel shortages slowed tanks, and trucks froze on the roadside. Every kilometer became harder than the last. By December 19th, Manstein's spearhead had stalled less than 50 kilometers from the Sixth Army. For Paulus, the distance was agonizing. He requested permission to break out to fight his way toward Manstein while the gap was still narrow. But Hitler once again refused. "The Sixth Army will remain in Stalingrad," he ordered. "Relief will come to you." It was a death sentence. Without Paulus's cooperation, Manstein could not close the gap. His divisions were too few, his supply lines too long, his flanks too exposed. Soviet reinforcements poured into the sector, blunting his offensive. Within days, Operation Winter Storm ground to a halt. The relief force withdrew battered and exhausted. For the men inside Stalingrad, the failure was crushing. One soldier recalled, "We heard the guns so close, we thought salvation was hours away. Then the guns fell silent. We knew we were alone." The disappointment was compounded by the arrival of Christmas. Snow blanketed the ruins of the city, covering corpses and wreckage in a deceptive peace. German soldiers freezing in their dugouts tried to mark the holiday with what little they had. Some lit candles made of melted fat, others sang carols in hoarse voices. Yet the contrast between tradition and reality was unbearable. On Christmas Day, over 1,300 men died of frostbite alone. The Sixth Army, once a symbol of German, might now resemble a starving horde of beggars in uniform. Paulus's reports to Berlin grew increasingly desperate. He described thousands of untreated wounded, no fuel, no ammunition, and men reduced to eating horse carcasses. But Hitler, ensconced in his headquarters, remained unmoved. To him, Stalingrad was not a place, it was an idea. To abandon it was unthinkable, even if it meant sacrificing the entire army. The Soviets, sensing the Germans' despair, increased pressure. They launched relentless probing attacks, harassing the shrinking perimeter day and night. Mortar fire rained on German positions, shells tearing through the makeshift shelters of starving soldiers. Snipers picked off anyone who moved in daylight. At night, the cries of the wounded carried across the snow. Discipline disintegrated. Soldiers fought over scraps of bread, robbed supply drops, and deserted their posts in search of food. Some turned to cannibalism, their comrades disappearing in the night. Officers tried to maintain order, but their authority collapsed alongside morale. Letters found later described a world where men lived like wolves, each waiting for the other to die so he might eat. For the Soviets, the spectacle was grim, but vindicating. They had turned the tables on the once invincible Wehrmacht. Red Army soldiers who months earlier had feared annihilation now looked across the battlefield with hardened pride. One Soviet officer wrote, "We do not fight men here, we fight ghosts. They are already dead, though they still hold rifles." The Luftwaffe, already strained to breaking, could do nothing to alter the outcome. Supply flights dwindled as losses mounted. Planes that did reach the pocket often dropped their cargo, inaccurately scattering crates across Soviet lines. Desperate Germans watched in horror as supplies meant for them landed among their enemies. The airlift, once touted as salvation, had become a farce. By the end of December, Paulus's 6th Army was collapsing. Starvation hollowed men into skeletons. Frostbite blackened their flesh. Ammunition ran so low that some units fought with shovels and knives. The hospitals were charnel houses filled with the stench of rot and the groans of the dying. Operation Winter Storm had been the last real chance to save them. Its failure marked the turning point from hope to inevitability. Now the only question was how long the 6th Army could endure before annihilation. For Paulus, the wait was unbearable. He was a career officer, trained to obey orders, loyal to his superiors. But each day brought more pleas from his men, more reports of starvation and despair. And each time Berlin's answer was the same: hold Stalingrad. Christmas passed. The new year loomed. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, the 6th Army waited not for rescue, but for the end. January 1943 arrived in Stalingrad not with celebration, but with silence broken only by the crack of Soviet artillery and the cries of the dying. The 6th Army was no longer an army. It was a collection of starving, frost-bitten men clinging to the ruins. Entire regiments had vanished, consumed by hunger disease and ceaseless bombardment. The encirclement that had begun in November was now a tightening vice, squeezing the last breath from Paulus's command. The Soviets pressed forward with renewed determination. On January 6th, they offered Paulus and his men a chance to surrender. The terms were generous by the standards of the Eastern Front humane treatment food medical care. For a moment, Paulus considered it. His men were dying by the thousands, their ammunition nearly gone. But Hitler's orders were clear. There would be no surrender. The 6th Army will stand fast, fight to the last man, to the last bullet. Paulus obeyed, though his heart was heavy. He knew what this meant for his men. The hospitals were overflowing. 10,000 untreated wounded lay freezing in tents, their bodies stiffening as temperatures plunged below -20. Fuel was gone. Planes no longer landed. The last usable airfield fell into Soviet hands, severing the final link to the outside world. The army was cut off entirely. Whatever supplies they had left would be their last. By mid-January, the 6th Army was split into two pockets, north and south, cut off from each other. Communication collapsed. Units fought in isolation, commanders reduced to issuing orders scribbled on scraps of paper. Men scavenged for food in the snow, gnawed on leather belts, boiled wallpaper paste for sustenance. Some dug through the frozen corpses of horses, scraping fat from bones. Others simply gave up lying down in the ruins to die. Hitler's response was grotesque. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power, he promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive, and Hitler intended the promotion as a death sentence. He expected Paulus to take his own life rather than surrender. But Paulus refused. He had seen enough death. "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal," he reportedly said, a thinly veiled insult to Hitler. The next day, Soviet troops stormed Paulus's headquarters, a basement beneath a ruined department store. Surrounded, Paulus and his staff surrendered. The once proud commander of the 6th Army, the man entrusted with conquering Stalingrad, became the first German field marshal ever taken prisoner. In the southern pocket, news of Paulus's capture spread quickly. Resistance collapsed within hours. Soldiers threw down their rifles, emerging from ruins with their hands raised. Some wept with relief, others with shame. On February 2nd, 1943, the last remnants of the 6th Army surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The cost was staggering. Of the 300,000 men who had marched into Stalingrad, fewer than 91,000 surrendered. Most were skeletal, too weak to stand. Among them were 24 generals. Barely 5,000 would ever return to Germany after years of captivity. The rest perished in Soviet camps. The battle had destroyed an entire German army, something unimaginable only months earlier. The civilian toll was equally horrific. 170,000 civilians died during the battle, many buried beneath rubble or burned alive during the Luftwaffe raids. Thousands more were deported to German labor camps where starvation and brutality awaited. For the survivors, Stalingrad was no longer a city, but a graveyard. Streets were unrecognizable factories, flattened neighborhoods erased. It would take decades to rebuild. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was more than a victory. It was a resurrection. The Red Army had not only defended a city, but destroyed the myth of German invincibility. Stalingrad became the symbol of Soviet endurance, the turning point of the Second World War. From this moment, the tide flowed westward. For the Germans, it was a catastrophe that shattered their aura of superiority. The Wehrmacht, once feared as unstoppable, had been broken in the ruins of a city that Hitler should never have attacked. Stalingrad exposed the hubris of the Nazi leadership, their disregard for logistics, and their obsession with prestige over strategy. Eyewitnesses struggled to describe the scale of the horror. One German survivor wrote, "It was not war anymore. It was the end of the world." A Soviet soldier recalled, "We fought among ghosts. The city was a cemetery, every wall hiding death." Even decades later, the name Stalingrad carries a weight unlike any other. It is synonymous with sacrifice, with endurance, with the cruelty and futility of total war. For 6 months, 2 armies hurled themselves into the furnace, and out of that furnace came ashes, ruin, and a turning point in history. When the guns finally fell silent, the Volga flowed quietly again, carrying away the wreckage of war. But its waters were thick with memory of firestorms and starvation of civilians, digging trenches of soldiers fighting hand to hand in ruined factories, of Paulus's surrender in a basement. Stalingrad had been defended to the last, and in doing so, it had changed the course of the world. The city was rubble, but the legend was unbreakable.